Because America is hardcore. Same name, different game. Ninja Gaiden 3, The Ancient Ship of Doom. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Nintendo Entertainment Celebration, a 6-episode series here on Same Name Different Game looking at only the NES and the Famicom. This episode we're going to be talking about a later NES game with 1991's Ninja Gaiden 3, The Ancient Ship of Doom. So let's get started with a little history. In 1988, Tecmo released Ninja Gaiden in the arcade and the NES. They were developed simultaneously by separate teams, similar to Strider on the NES and in the arcade. Numerous versions of Ninja Gaiden followed, going to nearly every system under the sun, but that's a story for a different time. The important thing is that the NES adventures of Super Ninja Ryu Hayabusa were so successful, a sequel was ordered up almost immediately. Ninja Gaiden II, The Dark Sword of Chaos hit the NES in 1990 and was similarly a hit. These two games are renowned for their tough-as-nails difficulty, and with good reason, though the second game is slightly less difficult than the first. Beating the first Ninja Gaiden on NES is still considered a badge of honor among many a game enthusiast, but something happened between the second and third installments of the Ninja Gaiden franchise. The first two NES games were directed by Hideo Yoshizawa, but for the third, the reins were handed to Masato Kato, who worked on the first two, designing the graphics and the art assets. Kato would go on to work for Square, contributing to games in many famous franchises, including the Mana series, the Chrono series, and the Final Fantasy series, but his sole credit directing action games is Ninja Gaiden 3 for the NES and the Famicom. Kato dramatically changed Ninja Gaiden. He made the conscious decision to make the third installment more accessible than the first two, and in the summer of 1991, the final installment of the original trilogy was released. First in Japan as Ninja Ryukenden 3, Yomi no Hakobune, which is literally translated as Legend of the Ninja Dragon Sword 3, The Ark of Hades. And yes, as we normally do with imports on this show, we are waiving the strict same name requirement. Ninja Ryukenden 3 was a drastic departure from the earlier games in terms of difficulty. It added a password system, the ability to hang from certain platforms, and a new ninja magic that shoots up and down simultaneously. It also made checkpoints more forgiving and introduced a frequently found power-up that extends Ryu's sword, both in front of him as well as vertically, making shorter enemies and aerial ones easier to hit. In keeping with the series to that point, it allowed for infinite continues. It merits mentioning that easier does not mean easy. Yes, this game is not as controller-smashingly hard as the first Ninja Gaiden on NES, but that doesn't make it a Sunday drive, particularly in the later stages. Still, this didn't sit right with Tecmo's American branch, and so changes had to be made. It's important at this point that I explain the rental situation. For me, growing up in the Midwest, my family was comfortable but not rich. It so happened that a local store called Village Video rented movies as well as video games, and for something like $2 a pop, my parents were happy to rent me games pretty frequently, while buying new games was typically reserved for my birthday or Christmas, or as a reward for a good report card. But had I grown up in Japan, this would not be the case. In 1984, the Japanese Copyright Act was changed to effectively outlaw game rentals. Yes, there are some exceptions, but in the interest of keeping this video focused, we'll just go ahead and say that renting video games has been mostly illegal for the last 31 years. This is the reason that things like the Famicom disk writing kiosks were created. You would take a blank Famicom disk system disk and put it in a kiosk in a software store, and it would write a game to it. This was much cheaper than buying a brand new game, especially a cartridge, and the reason was to lessen the financial impact while the option of rental wasn't available. So what does all this have to do with Ninja Gaiden 3? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, this is going to be a different kind of episode of Same Name, Different Game. Usually I talk about graphical differences, sound differences, and things like that. In this instance, all that is the same. The soundtrack is exactly the same. The story and the cutscenes are exactly the same. There's not even really any interesting censorship to talk about in this game. The only thing that's different is the difficulty. And why? Well, it's widely speculated that these changes were made so the game couldn't be beaten on a rental. In a 2009 interview with Hardcore Gaming 101, Masato Kato had the following to say: NR1 and 2 had been extraordinarily hard and had a general reputation as ultra-maniac games. With 3, we wanted to change that as much as possible to create a game a normal player can enjoy. But I guess hard games were popular with American gamers, so the company demanded make it harder, and that's why the NES version got changed. It seems like Kato didn't really know why the changes were demanded, just that they were, but the rental explanation makes a lot of sense. So in its trans-Pacific journey, when the Ark of Hades turned into the ancient ship of doom, what changed? Well, a lot, actually, besides just the cover art. So let's take a closer look. Right from the beginning, we see looking at the US title screen that the password option is gone. In the Famicom version, short passwords were provided to allow the player to pick the game up at continue points, but the NES one demands all of your attention. Beat it in one sitting, or leave your NES on overnight. Well, I mean, provided that you can do it with 5 continues. Yeah, you heard me right. 5. 5 continues. The earlier games in the series were diamond hard, but at least they gave you infinite continues, feeding that maybe I can do it if I just have one more try kind of feeling. But 3? 5 continues. Then it's back to the beginning. Fortunately, there is a trick that will get you 99 continues, but in a game this hard, it's possible that you go through all of those. It's also a really obtuse code, and from what I could find, wasn't discovered until some time after the game's initial release. But hey, Kato said they made the game less ultra-maniac, right? So 5 continues should be plenty, right? No. They also increased the number of enemies. The best example for this I can provide is Stage 3 1A. Just look side by side. There are a lot of enemies that weren't present in the Japanese version. And I like a good challenge, but this is a segment I breezed through in the Famicom version and had to use multiple continues on in the US version. And the increased enemy count in and of itself would probably be fine if there weren't other changes made that compound that problem. First of all, in the American release, the knockback is way worse when taking a hit. Just look at how this thing basically pushes me off this platform. It's not that you get knocked back further necessarily, it's that some enemies will keep knocking you back as long as they're touching you, and you don't regain control of Ryu's fall as fast as you do in the Japanese release. Adding to that, in the NES version, all the enemies and hazards do about twice as much damage to you as they do in the Japanese one. Just look. This is Stage 1. In the Japanese version, this thing hits me. Ryu loses 1 stick of health. Now, in the NES version, this running dude, who doesn't even exist in the Famicom version, hits me for 2 health. And it only gets worse. These spikes in the later levels do 3 damage to Ryu in Ark of Hades, but in Ancient Ship of Doom, 6. Ryu only has 16 sticks of health. These spikes take over 1/3 of your health. But hey, at least there are health pickups, right? Except when there aren't. That's right, they removed health pickups in the US version. Not completely, but there are considerably fewer, and they weren't super plentiful in the Japanese version to begin with. But take a look at this example. In 7.3c, one of the final sections of the game, and one of the toughest in both versions, there's a health pickup in the Famicom game. In the NES version, it's replaced with a standard weapon energy pickup. But at least they didn't reduce the amount of health you get from picking one of these up in the US version. But hey, on the bright side, at least your arsenal is just as complete in both versions. Provided you can find it in the US version. Yes, along with the removal of health pickups, several sub-weapon pickups and about half of the sword extension power-ups are removed. Look at this example. In 4.1a, the Japanese version has a sword extension. The US version changes it to an Art of the Fire Wheel, and it's not just moved to somewhere else in the same section, it's removed completely. And while I'm on the subject of reused weapons, the scrolls you find to increase your sub-weapon ammo limit are fewer in number as well. Fortunately, only one is removed, but that extra 10 sub-weapon energy can be the difference between life and death in the later stages. It's here in 5.2c in the Japanese version, but it's changed to another standard weapon energy pickup in the US version. This is exhausting. Alright, I already talked about the continues thing, but there's some stuff related to that. Checkpointing. In the American version, the checkpoints you use when losing a life are the same as the checkpoints given to you in the Japanese version when you continue. And if you continue in the American version, you go all the way back to the beginning of the stage. And this is sort of outrageous. Some of these stages are really long and very tough. Let's take a look, using the final stage as an example. Here, you see me die on the first of 3 final bosses. In the Japanese version, I go back to 7.3d, the last section before the boss. It's not too tough once you've done it a couple of times. But in the US version, I go back to 7.3a, which means I have 4 sections to go through. Now, let's see the continue scenario. In the Famicom version, I go back to 7.3a where I was in the NES game after simply losing a life. And in the NES game, I go back to 7.1a and have to take on the entire final stage again. And yes, I realize that makes it more in line with the first 2 games in the series, but at least those games had the dignity to allow you infinite continues so you could keep trying. Whew. Well, that's all the differences. This game went from being the easiest in the original trilogy to being the hardest of the 8-bit series by the time it hit America, which is just weird. Now, later it was ported to the Super Nintendo as part of the Ninja Gaiden trilogy compilation cart. That version restores the password function and gives you infinite continues, but it does keep the arrangement of enemies and items seen in the US version on both the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo. Also, this cart is extremely expensive in the secondary market. We're talking $100 minimum. If you want it with the box and the instructions, we're going up over the $200 mark. And the fact is, it's no Super Mario All-Stars. The ports are pretty slapdash. So if you must check out the trilogy versions, I recommend picking up the Ninja Gaiden remake on the original Xbox, which includes the Ninja Gaiden trilogy game as an unlockable bonus. And that game is about $5. Still, in spite of all the changes, Ninja Gaiden 3 The Ancient Ship of Doom isn't a bad game. I know I've been giving it a hard time, but it was well received, getting positive reviews from most of the outlets of the day, including GamePro, Nintendo Power, and even EGM. It's not the greatest action side-scroller on the NES, and honestly it is in my estimation the worst of the NES trilogy, but it's still a good game on balance, and it's worth your time. And so I give the edge. Yes, Ninja Gaiden 3 is worth your time. But the catch is that it's not as good as the Japanese version. This one is more fair, it's more fun, and possibly most importantly, it's cheaper. much cheaper. In fact, as of this recording, this one goes for about double what this one does. So, get yourself a converter, get yourself a Famicom. Go ahead and take the Ark of Hades for a spin. You won't regret it, I promise. And that wraps up this episode of Same Name, Different Game. But come back next month as the Nintendo Entertainment Celebration continues unabated, and we enter unlicensed territory. We'll see you then.